name is Ann Mason. I am the Executive Director of the Plymouth Antiquarian Society. I'm filming from Oak Grove Cemetery in Plymouth, Massachusetts. Oak Grove sits next to Vine Hill Cemetery. The two are just east of Route 3, and they're sandwiched by Samoset Street on the north and Summer Street on the south. We're just inside the Summer Street entrance at Oak Grove. Both cemeteries are still in use today. They're about 50 acres together. The land here was originally owned by Nathaniel Jackson and Joseph Bramhall. By 1735, Thomas Spooner had become the owner, and it became known as Spooner's Woods. His descendants held the property until 1841, when the Oak Grove Cemetery Association was formed. It originally, at that time, was made up of 16 acres laid out to hold 149 family plots. Vine Hills was farmland. Although it did have some early 19th century burials there, it wasn't acquired by the town for a cemetery until 1870. Oak Grove provides a wonderful example of the influence of the garden style or rural cemetery movement that was popular in the 19th century. The goal was to create a park-like destination for the living, as well as a final resting place for the dead. This happened primarily in urban areas for a number of reasons. First, there was a land use problem. Valuable space in cities was being taken up by graveyards, and there was, of course, increasing demand for more burial space as the population grew. So burying grounds in city churchyards were just not big enough. And of course, accompanying the need for more space was concerns about disease and the spread of disease from rotting bodies that were buried too close to the surface. The idea was that you could move burials outside of the city and at the same time create a tranquil and beautiful place where families could come to commemorate their loved ones. And the monument for the dead in these natural settings were works of art for the living. It truly was an open-air museum. The rural cemetery movement in America began here in Massachusetts with Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, founded in 1831. At the ceremony to consecrate the land on September 24, 1831, Joseph Story gave the main address. Joseph Story was an Associate Supreme Court Justice, a professor of law at Harvard University, and Mount Auburn's first president. At the time that he spoke, he was still mourning the loss of his 10-year-old daughter to scarlet fever. The words that he gives here really encapsulate the vision of the rural cemetery movement. He said, "It is to the living mourner, to the parent weeping over his dear dead child, to the husband dwelling in his own solitary desolation, to the widow whose heart is broken by untimely sorrow, to the friend who misses at every turn the presence of some kindred spirit. Thus these repositories of the dead caution us by the very silence of our own frail and transitory being. They instruct us in the true value of life and in its noble purposes, its duties, and its destination. They spread around us in the reminiscences of the past, sources of pleasing, though melancholy, reflection. We dwell with pious fondness on the characters and virtues of the departed, and as time interposes its growing distances between us and them, we gather up, and with more solicitude, the broken fragments of memory, and weave into our very hearts the threads of their history. As we sit down by their graves, we seem to hear the tones of their affection whispering in our ears. We listen to the voice of their wisdom speaking in the depths of our souls. We shed our tears, but they are no longer the burning tears of agony. They relieve our drooping spirits. We return to the world, and we feel ourselves purer and better and wiser from this communion with the dead. Laurel Hill Cemetery in Philadelphia was founded in 1836 and is another prime example of one of the early rural cemeteries. And close to us here in Plymouth, there's also Forest Hill Cemetery in Jamaica Plain, which was founded in 1848. Now, it became common for families to come to these cemeteries, and not just to remember the dead, but also to picnic. It was an escape from the city, a place to walk and enjoy beautiful plantings, and just an overall peaceful setting. There were guides on how to landscape these new cemeteries. They talked about how you should select different trees and flowering shrubs and other plants to create this park-like setting. So this is the context in which the Oak Grove Cemetery Association in Plymouth is designing this site in 1841. Although there were earlier graves here, they're now intentionally shaping a landscape that reflects a 19th century attitude towards death. And this attitude can basically be summarized by the idea that death is not separate from life, that the living can dwell among the dead in a way, not in some kind of creepy way. They're not afraid of being haunted in these cemeteries, but it's a way for them to come to grips with the grief that they have, to feel inspired and to feel a sense of peace, even as they grieve. The plan of Oak Grove that was recorded in 1841 shows a roughly circular design with irregular side paths. So the roads are named after natural features. There's Valley Road, Ridge Road, Forest Avenue, Ocean Avenue, and River Road. And the paths linking them are named after plants. So there's Empetrum Path, which Empetrums are dwarf evergreen shrubs, commonly known as crowberries. There's a Mayflower Path and a Violet Path. And it's a good thing these paths are named, because it's actually very easy to get lost here. As you can see, the terrain is rather hilly, and the paths and the roads just sort of meander through them. So again, the idea is that this is more like a park that you can come and you can walk and you can think and reflect on what you see around you. And as this cemetery movement, the rural cemetery movement, is influencing the creation of these new cemeteries, it's also influencing the way that people are re-landscaping old burying grounds. So Burial Hill here in Plymouth, for most of its history, was bare. There were no trees growing on it. It was originally Fort Hill, the site of the Pilgrims' Fort, and you needed a clear hill in order to get that panoramic view to protect yourself from enemies. So here in Burial Hill in the 19th century, really the late 19th century, you start having trees being planted, you start having paths laid out between graves, so that Burial Hill becomes more park-like, even though it originally was not intended to be a park. So we're going to walk down Anemone Lane. Anemone is, in the 19th century language of flowers, it was symbolic of fragility and forsaken love and death. So it's an appropriate flower for this cemetery. And you can see as we walk that there are a number of granite gravestones here. Now, granite became, in the late 19th century, really the most popular gravestone material, and it remains so today. At that time, there were new machines that actually were able to carve it efficiently. And because granite is more durable than slate or marble, it really just took off as the main building material for gravestones. You can also see here, though, there are gravestones made of marble as you just scan around. What you'll notice is that there are a number of family plots. Some of them are rather simply identified by just a plain granite curbing, and then others are more elaborate. And we're going to walk over to one of them. This is the family plot for the Eads family. And it is one of perhaps the grandest, or one of the most grand memorial family plots here in Oak Grove. And we're going to look at some of the iconography here on these memorials. So you'll see that the steps going up to the main memorial are framed by urns, and then at the top of the memorial you have a draped urn. Now, urns became used after the American Revolution in gravestone iconography as a symbol for mourning, for grief. The Romans had used urns as a container for ashes, holding the ashes of the dead, because the Romans practiced cremation. They would burn the bodies of the deceased. And so the urn becomes used as a symbol of the physical body returning to dust, even as the soul is everlasting. But what I want to point out is that cremation in this period was still not practiced here in Plymouth or in America. It was seen as a pagan practice for many generations, and even by the late 19th century, it was a really radical idea. It was frowned on by, it was seen as something pagan, not something that Christians would do. But again, in the late 19th century, as you have the problem of urbanization and population growth and cemetery overcrowding, cremation begins to come back into focus, and people say, well, maybe we can use cremation as a way to dispose of the dead, a new way that is modern, sanitary, state-of-the-art. But the first public crematory was not built until 1884 in Pennsylvania. And here in Massachusetts, the first person to be cremated was the suffragist Lucy Stone, and that didn't happen until 1893 at the Forest Hill Cemetery in Boston. So the urn here is a symbol of mourning, but it's not a sign that cremation is being practiced. Now you can see the urn at the top of the memorial shows this cloth draped over it. Now drapery on headstones typically depicts the veil between life and death. Sometimes you'll see it as a curtain pulled back that could then be either opened or closed. And again, black cloth was often used to drape coffins on the way to burial. And so having the cloth over the urn sort of amplifies the symbolism of the sorrow and the mourning associated with the death. Now if we look, we can get closer to the memorial. And we can see that we have this lovely band of ivy. And ivy is a symbol that you will see in cemeteries. It's frequently just like that on granite stones of different sizes. And ivy is an evergreen vine, so often it's used to symbolize enduring friendship or everlasting love, or even the immortality of the soul, because it is a vine that seemingly doesn't die. So who is buried here in this family plot? We can see that there are a number of smaller headstones that bear the names of individuals, and their dates of birth and death and their relationships are listed on the main memorial itself. So just to go through them quickly, we have Oliver Eads, his wife Susan, their only daughter Lydia, and her only daughter Susie. On the back of the stone, we have the names of Lydia's son, Charles, and his wife, Harriet. And then on this side, we have Oliver and Susan's son, William, his wife, Ellen, and their children, Arthur and Alice. So we know that this is the Eads family plot. We know the people who are buried here, but there are several clues about who's most important. So if we come back to the front of the memorial, we can see at the top the intertwined initials O and E, standing for Oliver Eads. And if we walk back out down the steps, we can see that Oliver's name is here again in very prominent raised capital letters, Oliver Eads. So he is the patriarch, and he is the most important person buried here. At least he's the person that your attention is directed towards. Now, Oliver was born in 1815 in Needham. He received a common school education, and then at 16, he went to work on the Boston Mill Dam, and he learned nail making. He eventually ended up in South Braintree, where he was running tack machines, and at just 22, he invented the first rivet machine. So this was a way to cut drawn wire in all different sizes and forms to make small rivets. Up to this point, rivet making had been hand labor, and rivets were incredibly expensive to import. And a lot of people thought that the machine could never do it as well as an actual person. However, Oliver Eads created a machine that did it quite well, and he was able to start in Marshfield with Andrew Holmes a new factory. Now, if you search on Google Patents for patent US 1564A, you can actually find the 1840 patent registered for Andrew Holmes and Oliver Eads for this rivet making machine. He then formed the firm of Ferris, Eads and Company in Plymouth, not too far from Oak Grove, on the town brook off Billington Street. And then in 1850, he created a new firm called Eads and Wood with Nathaniel Wood of Plymouth. And they began producing tacks and zinc nails. And they actually purchased the forge that was on Forges Pond in Chiltonville, and that's where they created their new factory for rolling zinc nail plate. He continued that business with his son Edwin, who the firm name then changed in 1880 to Oliver Eads and Son. And Edwin is not buried here in this family plot. He's buried in a separate plot in Oak Grove. Oliver Eads also went on in 1883 to invest in mining zinc from the mountains of Virginia and Tennessee. And so he created Eads Mixture and Healed Zinc Company to make zinc metal from the ores. He died in 1884 of Bright's disease of the kidneys, which today we would know as nephritis. And his death was recorded nationally, including in an engineering journal called Mechanics. So he was very well respected, not just here in Plymouth, but also in the world of manufacturing and engineering and invention throughout the country. Now, there is a biographical sketch published in the History of Plymouth County, which was compiled by D. Hamilton Hurd in 1884. And that sort of shows us a little bit, again, about Oliver Eads' prominence, the fact that he was included in this publication, but it also says something interesting about him personally. It reads, "Oliver Eads was a kind, sympathetic man, a great lover of nature, of the trees, of the shrubs, and of the flowers, and among the noble traits of his sterling character was that of unostentatious benevolence." So I like to think that Oliver Eads would be very happy to be buried here in Oak Grove Cemetery. If he was a lover of nature, as his biography suggests, then he certainly is surrounded by it. It's a beautiful setting, especially on a day like today when the sun is shining and the birds are singing. But we do have, in the midst of this tranquil setting, this garden-like setting, we have this massive monument that still is supposed to communicate to us the wealth of the individual who's erected it. And of course, the Eads family were successful in their business enterprises, and so they were quite prosperous. And here's a monument to that success, as well as it does bear those symbols of loss and mourning that we've seen elsewhere. But it is beautifully situated here in Oak Grove Cemetery.